Thank you very much for joining us for today's conference on delivering net zero from the Institute for Government. My name is Gemma Tetlow, I'm Chief Economist at the Institute for Government, and I will be chairing this session this afternoon. And I'd like to start by thanking the sponsors for today's event, the Association of British Insurers, the Association for Project Management, Imperial College London Transition to Zero Pollution Initiative, and Novo Nordisk, without whom this wouldn't have been possible. I'm delighted to be joined for the next hour by three excellent panellists to discuss this topic. We have Professor Sir Dieter Helm, who's Professor of Economic Policy at the University of Oxford and has advised the UK and EU governments extensively on energy and climate issues, including until last November as chair of the Natural Capital Committee. He's also written numerous books on this subject, including most recently Net Zero, in which he lays out how to combat the climate emergency. We also have Paul Johnson, who's Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies and member of the Climate Change Committee, and Rain Newton-Smith, who is Chief Economist at the Confederation of British Industry. We'll have about 25 minutes at the end of this session for questions from all of you, so please do start sending those in via the Q&A function throughout the session. And if you'd like to, please add your name and where you're sending your question from, because it's interesting to know where everyone's tuning in from today. Today's session will be on the record, and my colleagues will be live tweeting it from the @IFG Events Twitter account using the hashtag #IFGNetZero. So please do follow and tweet along with that. And a sound and video recording of this event will be available on our website within 24 hours. Before I hand over to our panellists for their opening remarks, I'd like to start by introducing Ben Wilson, who is Director of Advocacy at the Association of British Insurers, who will make a few introductory remarks.
Thank you, Gemma. The ABI is really pleased to sponsor such an important panel discussion, and which couldn't be more timely as we head into COP26. The ABI represents the UK's world-leading insurance and long-term savings sector, and our members manage 1.6 trillion of assets and will therefore be crucial to the success of any strategy to finance net zero before 2050. And I'm really pleased to say that the ABI's board has made tackling climate change one of its very top priorities this year, with the task force of industry CEOs personally driving that work. We believe that our sector's investment potential can be maximised by combining things like the government's recent welcome announcement of a green bond, targeted reform of the Solvency II regime that regulates how our sector manages its capital, and a consistent and clear taxonomy for green investments. However, it would be wrong to see our sector's role as only in terms of providing finance. Our members see the effects of climate change firsthand. In recent years, the London market has absorbed multi-billion-pound losses from hurricanes and wildfires, while domestic insurers paid out more than 540 million for winter storms in 2019 and early 2020. We can also help consumers make the adaptations necessary. Transitioning to electric vehicles and retrofitting buildings will require product innovation from insurers, while long-term savings providers are providing new, greener ways to invest for consumers as they plan their financial futures for retirement. While the net zero targets are long-term, the decisions required to meet them are not, and insurance and long-term savings providers, connected as they are to every part of the economy, will play a pivotal role in financing and rolling out these changes. And for all those reasons, I'm really looking forward to hearing from our panel about how we can work with both the wider business community, with government, regulators, and esteemed climate change experts like we have on the panel to tell us how exactly we might do this. So thank you, Gemma. I'll hand back to you.
Thanks very much, Ben. Paul, can I come to you instead to start with? You're on the Committee on Climate Change, and the committee recently published its report on the UK's 6th carbon budget, which will take the UK quite a long way towards net zero. Can you give us your thoughts on what the government needs to think about in paying for transition and distributing costs?
Yes, I think you've given me 3 minutes and I'll see what I can do in those 3 minutes. I think the first place to start actually is to understand what we've done so far. We've made quite a big reduction over the last decade or so in carbon emissions, mainly through the electricity sector, and that's essentially all being paid for by consumers. Now, there's been a significant offsetting effect there in the sense that houses have become better insulated and our gadgets have become more efficient, but that is very clearly how that's being paid for. That is, of course, regressive, for example, relative to a progressive income tax, and to the extent that lower income households have a higher fraction of their spending on electricity than higher income ones, that is something we might be concerned about, though the politics of this have worked remarkably well because nobody's noticed. Rather different what it would have looked like had we imposed a carbon tax or a VAT on electricity consumption. Going forward, just to give some sense of at least one kind of measure of the cost, the Climate Change Committee estimates that we'll need to spend something like £50 billion a year, each year for the next 30 years on investments in green technology of one kind or another. That adds up to a pretty hefty 1.5 trillion by my estimates over that 30 years. That's about something like a 15% increase in UK overall investment. So that's a pretty substantial amount of money. Now, a lot of the net costs of that comes up front because there are savings in the future. We have to spend a lot on windmills up front, but then the wind doesn't cost anything, unlike coal power stations where you have to keep paying for the coal into the future. And a fair bit of green technologies like that, we're going to have to replace probably all of the gas boilers in the 30 million or so homes in the UK, or at least get them running on hydrogen. That's going to be pretty expensive, but once that's up and running, it should be cheaper to operate. So the key issues around all of that are: where does the money come up front, who pays for it in terms of higher bills and so on. And there's a separate set of issues actually about who pays for other aspects of the transition if some kinds of jobs disappear. Mechanics who repair petrol-driven vehicles are not necessarily going to be needed for repairing electric vehicles. People working in refining and so on may not have jobs. So we need to get that sort of transition right. But in terms of the 50 billion or so investment up front, the Climate Change Committee's view is that the large majority of that will come from the private sector in one way or another, but that will result in increased prices in the short run. When we're talking about things like replacing gas boilers and so on, there's clearly a set of choices about that, the extent to which we subsidise or don't subsidise households do it. It would strike me as being likely that there'll need to be significant subsidy for that to make that an acceptable way of moving forward. But the key thing here are two key things. First is that these changes and policies need to be done in an efficient way, because the prices, the costs will spiral quickly if we get this wrong, either through government getting things wrong, and that does happen, or through inefficiencies in the market. And secondly, that we spread these costs in a way which is and is seen to be relatively fair and just across the population. I've probably already spent more than my 3 minutes and said very little, and happy to take a much further discussion along some of those lines.
Thank you very much, Paul. Dieter, I will come back to you now. I think we've managed to sort out the tech problems. So over to you for a brief summary of the arguments in your book. I think you will need to unmute yourself.
So let me wind back from Paul's very helpful explanation of where the Climate Change Committee got to. So in this discussion about climate change, I think that the British public, etc., think that they are unilaterally no longer going to cause climate change when they get to net zero. And it seems to me that that is really rather questionable. So the Climate Change Committee last year, 2019, I think, said, by reducing emissions produced in the UK to zero, we also end our contributions to rising global emissions. No, we're never going to get to zero, and we're never going to end our emissions, our contributions to global warming on the basis of territorial, unilateral carbon production, unless everybody else in the world has got to the same point. And China isn't proposing to get there. There's not much evidence that India is going to get there. Africa probably won't. So if you actually really do want to unilaterally stop causing a global problem, then you have to address carbon consumption and not just carbon production. It's not enough to not open a coal mine in Britain, but import the coke from somewhere else around the world. That doesn't actually make climate change any better. It makes it worse. I'm not in favour of opening the coal mine, but it's the point to make. Okay, so that's the first point. The second point is climate change is the consequence of both emissions and sequestration. So the only number that matters is not territorial production in the UK, but the parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere. That's what causes climate change. And long before humans came along, the natural environment has been absorbing carbon and emitting carbon, and indeed we're all made of carbon, so it's that balance at stake. So we don't want to focus just on emissions, we want to focus on sequestration as well. Next point is, if we are focusing on emissions in the UK, then transport's up there at the top, then heating, then comes power, but relative to size, agriculture is 0.6% of the economy, produces, when you add in soils, which have 4 times the carbon of the atmosphere, as in the atmosphere, about 15% of emissions. So agriculture is where you start, and agriculture is where emissions and sequestration come to bind. So if we look at the parts per million in the atmosphere, we've been working at this climate change problem for 30 years, and we've made no progress in addressing the trend line. It's 2 parts per million every single year added to the carbon concentration in the atmosphere, including last year. So even the coronavirus lockdowns did not change the increase of carbon concentration in the atmosphere. And therefore, if we really want to no longer contribute to climate change, A, it's going to cost more than 1%. But of course, the 1% that Paul refers to, he rightly says, this assumes that government gets it right. The history of energy policy is littered with examples of government failure, substantive government failure, and there's no reason to believe that this government is going to get it any better right than previous ones. Just to have a look at the previous Green Deal, a fiasco, the smart meters, there's a whole host of these things. So the end result of this is, if we really want to no longer cause climate change, it's a much more demanding task than the one that we've set ourselves. And secondly, it's going to cost more than the baseline estimate, unless you think we've invented perfect government, because they've listened to the Institute for Government and decided that they know now how to do these things because you've instructed them correctly. Thank you.
Well, I hope they are listening to us, but I'm not so much of an optimist to think that everything will go swimmingly from here on. Rain, let me come to you then for your opening remarks. How does this question of paying for transition look to your members, and what are your members looking for government to do in order for them to play their part in this?
Thanks, Gemma, and good afternoon, everyone. And I think maybe to just sort of build on what the other panelists have said, I think no one is sort of underestimating the scale of the challenge, and I certainly agree with what Dieter is saying. We need to think not only about the carbon emissions within our production, but also within our consumption. Though I'm certainly hopeful, I think, particularly this year with the UK hosting COP26 and the UN climate negotiations here in November, that the more we can persuade more countries to adopt those net zero targets, and if we're all moving in the same direction, that reduces some of the burden on just looking at the production side of the equation in some countries, and addresses that holistic issue. I absolutely agree. This is something that all countries have to tackle together. And I think in a way, what's been really heartening over the COVID pandemic is how much the issues and the desire, I think, from the business community to really help the UK move along that low carbon transition has, pardon the pun, there's been so much energy behind it, and I think real commitment. And what I've found from the business community actually is they are the ones who have been applying pressure to the government and saying, look, it's great that we saw that 10-point green industrial revolution plan, but there's more detail we need to see underneath it. And we do finally now have the energy white paper. but certainly earlier in the autumn, we were getting so many of our members coming to us and say we really need the government to sort of set the direction on our future sort of energy use and making the decisions that we need to see so that businesses can get behind and invest in some of the technologies we need to move to a low carbon economy. And I think as Paul sort of said in his work for the UK Committee on Climate Change, we need a huge amount of investment, that £15 billion per year. Now, a lot of that needs to come from the private sector. And so what are businesses sort of asking for that to happen? I think I'd point to sort of three things I think we need to see. One is about aligning the incentives in the system around taxation. It's secondly looking at our approach to regulation across sectors. So you can think of a sort of carrot and then the stick. But finally, I think what we are seeing is a lot of the drive to that low carbon transition is also coming from consumers and clients themselves. So I think first of all on that aligning the tax system to the move to a low carbon economy, I think in a way what's happened, we've had this sort of patchwork of rate tax and regulation which have built up over time before we really were focused on having a net zero target and before we started this acceleration in the move to reduce our carbon emissions. And so I think we need to look at that holistically, and one good example of that is what Paul was talking about and how we decarbonize heat in our buildings. We know that around 40% of buildings make up a large proportion of our carbon footprint, and a lot of that is the commercial property stock. And yet at the moment we have a business rate system. We know that in the UK we have a relatively high taxation on property for business, and at the moment if you make your commercial property more energy efficient, then that increases the rateable value of your property, and so that increases your business rates bill. And so there are things the government could do to provide some relief from business rates for a period of time if businesses make their commercial property building much more energy efficient. And I think it's those sorts of aligning of the tax system to the incentives we want to see, and getting both individuals and households investing in decarbonizing heat in our homes, but also thinking about commercial property. So I think that's one way of really having the right sort of carrots and incentives. And then I think secondly, it's about regulation and really being clear what sort of technologies we think for the moment will work to deliver a low carbon future, and where we need to see differences. So again, an example of that, we could be building homes right now that are carbon neutral in terms of their heat. The government have committed to doing that by under the Zero Carbon Homes initiative, but we could move further and faster on some of those. And there's examples around, we need to ban gas boilers by a set date, so businesses again can help. That drives the incentive to invest in some of the newer technologies, from heat pumps to district heat systems. And I think it will be quite local. You'll see different solutions on how we heat our homes in different areas. But I think you need to have clear regulations to help drive that investment. And finally, it's absolutely about galvanizing, I think, on what consumers and businesses, clients want to see in terms of the move to a low carbon economy. There's a whole piece there about transparency and reporting around climate risk, but also the wider carbon footprint that businesses have. But I think there's a huge piece around sharing best practice. And one of the things that we've been working on with Deloitte and the Met Office and many others is establishing a Goal 13 platform where businesses can share some of the best practice, not just how they set a carbon emissions reduction for their own business, but how they achieve that. What is the best way to reduce emissions within different sectors? And what you find there is that it's the drive from consumers and clients that really help to set those targets, and then it's important to have that credible plan to deliver those emissions. So I think really we need just a much more holistic approach that every government department is thinking about that net zero target. They're thinking about every policy they set and how it is aligned with that target, and bringing some of those decisions that need to happen across government and across government departments, so we have a much more holistic approach, both by the public sector, but also the private sector in delivering that net zero target.
Great, thank you very much, Rain. My first question then is, there were reports last week that the Prime Minister is considering an economy-wide carbon pricing mechanism. Do you think that's a move in the right direction? What would need to be done to make that work, and what would it mean about carbon pricing at the border? Dieter, perhaps I can come to you first, given that you talked about this question of the UK and within the world and carbon pricing that way.
Okay, so the first best economic efficient policy instrument, a necessary instrument, not sufficient because we want to do the infrastructure and other stuff, is that there is a uniform carbon price on everything. Right? On agriculture, transport, energy, heating, and applied at the border and domestically. Then the economy finds the least cost path, and we really will need to find a least cost path because I don't believe consumers will otherwise swallow what's there. So you might think, well, you know, we have a great opportunity. Brexit comes along, and whatever one's view of Brexit, we get out the common agricultural policy, we get out the common fisheries policy, and we can choose our own carbon pricing procedure. The Treasury put forward 3 options: shadowing the EU ETS, a UK ETS, or a carbon price. The EU ETS is now actually a carbon tax. The EU is manipulating the number of permits to produce the price that they would like to come out at the end, which is worse than the carbon price tax that they proposed back in 1991. But hey, there's a system there and it operates. Of the options, the obvious thing to do was to take this opportunity to introduce a carbon tax across the board. I think the Treasury wanted to pursue that. Bez in particular wanted a UK ETS, which is the worst option, because now we'll have negotiations sector by sector, industry by industry, and that leaves the residual problem. Well, that'll apply to the large industrial sector and the power sector, but what about agriculture, transport and heating? So then the Prime Minister or the government floats a kite. It's a classic new Institute of Government, we're interested in these things, kind of technique for policy. You float something up, let's have a tax on beef, dairy and domestic heating, okay? And what you do is you do 2 things. First of all, you signal to the climate change interest that you're on their side. So you get the symbol out there that you're trying to find ways forward. And then secondly, you find out what the lobbyists do and see how big the reaction is. And that's what's been going on in the newspapers this week. So we don't say we want to have a general agricultural tax. We don't want to say we want to get rid of subsidising red diesel. We pick on beef and dairy, okay? And this is what I call bespoke carbon taxation, okay? And any economist will say that you're interested in the substitution of the income effect and you're interested in the second best effects. And it's perfectly possible we end up with a patchwork quilt of individual carbon taxes on the politically acceptable places to hit, but don't have a coherent policy. And so if you look at beef and dairy, the right answer is that the big story in emissions in agriculture are soils, which is, you know, like power stations. We've just been stripping out the carbon. And by the way, the carbon and the biodiversity are closely correlated in the soil, and most biodiversity is below your feet. Okay, then it's about fertilizers, pesticides, and red diesel. Instead, we start with beef and dairy, and not a border adjustment either. So yes to a general carbon tax, yes to moving in that direction. Essential, as the NFU also point out, that it applies at the border too. But bespoke political tax step by step, probably not.
Paul, can I come to you next on that one? What's your take on this? Are you as sceptical as Dieter about the politics of this?
Well, I completely agree with every word that Dieter said, and he said it far more articulately than I could have done. Yes, of course, a carbon price across the economy as the right way to go, as a crucial but by no means only part of the policy. But do I have any real faith in the government delivering it? No, not really. Just take the most obvious impact of it, which would be to, you would want to start at least by not subsidising the consumption of gas, which we do by effectively having a low rate of VAT at 5% on it, and then you'd want to add another tax on top. Now that's the right thing to do, and if I was a nice dictator, then that's the thing that I would do. But I wouldn't get elected, as would very few of us think tankers, if I went to the population with that kind of policy, which is exactly why you end up with this sort of piecemeal type of approach that Dieter was referring to. So I think we are in the world of second best policies here. I think it's one of the reasons why we've ended up with a UK emission trading scheme, because an across the board UK tax was effectively politically ruled out. And I think the kind of kite flying that we've seen really is all about indicating willing and then having to go to the Green lobby and say, look, we can't possibly do it because everyone's against it. So yes, we should have it, but no, we won't have it.
And Rain, coming to you, I mean, what's your view from business? To what extent are government essentially receiving a whole load of disparate lobbying efforts from every industry, trying to avoid the cost being imposed on them? And are there ways around this of coming up with a more coherent approach to the government that might be sustainable for the government?
Well, I think I certainly hope with it as a CBI, we're trying to play a role in having that sort of whole economy approach. And I think, look, and I think there's a danger that the three of us are all going to like violently agree with each other. So I think, because I think what we're saying from sort of business, I think everyone kind of accepts you need to have some sort of principle of polluter pays, and having a way of addressing some of the externalities, and a carbon prices plays a really important role in that. And I think what business wants to see is that holistic approach, and their kind of nightmare scenario is you get this sort of piecemeal taxes here and taxes there, where it's not in a coherent whole, it's unpredictable, and then it's really hard for businesses to understand what the strategy is and where they need to invest behind some of those newer technologies. So I guess it's where we started from. We need to have a holistic tax strategy. I think there is an opportunity with the UK leaving the EU to look at our carbon pricing and what system we have. I think we definitely need to be mindful that we need some link with the sort of EU emissions trading scheme, because many businesses are sort of operating across borders, so we need to have some sort of link and scale often for those sort of trading systems to work well. So businesses have almost that's been the ask, what is the link between the UK system and the EU system, and they just want clarity absolutely on that. And I think the other danger, we've talked about that piecemeal approach, is that you have the EU pursuing one form of carbon border adjustment tax, but then we need, ideally, right, these things, economists love it when these things happen globally in a coordinated fashion, so that you have adjustment and not distortions between one trading area and another. But I guess the reality is that doesn't always happen. But there's definitely a role for that, and thinking about how it works and alleviates some of these challenge about if you're just looking at your emissions that you are producing within your country, then you're missing some of the emissions you are indirectly importing through consumption. So yeah, I think business just don't want to see that piecemeal approach. They definitely want a holistic approach, and the more clarity and long-term certainty they can get, the better. And I guess stepping back, if we think about I'll try and think of some things that have worked well, so we're not too pessimistic. I think if you look at how the offshore wind industry has developed, and when you look at how we've managed to decarbonize energy, and at times half of our energy sources are coming from renewable energy, and we can point to some good examples of how we did get some of the policies right to help develop some of those industries. And I think we need to learn from where that worked well and accelerate some of that going forward. That's definitely what we need to see.
Great, thank you. To pick up on something that you touched on, Rain, which was about investment in private companies and investing in those that are contributing to the pursuit of net zero. What is it that investors should be looking for to know that a company is playing its role in getting to net zero, and what sort of information do investors need to have access to judge those sorts of green credentials? Perhaps I'll come to you first, Rain, and then the others.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, ideally what we need is sort of transparency on individual businesses' overall emissions. So there are now duties around reporting your carbon emissions at a company level, and I think that's what we need to see. And I think having, if you think about the net zero transition, we can think about it at the macro level, but at a micro level for each individual business, we need them to be doing that race to net zero, a race to the top, where individual businesses are making commitments to reduce their carbon emissions. You need some way of verifying that, and CDP, the climate disclosures projects, and others have ways in which businesses or science-based targets can make clear and defined and verifiable commitments around their carbon emissions and how they will reduce those over time. So knowing what a business's carbon emissions is a key part of it. Of course, in terms of the investor community, there is now a hugely developed field in terms of ESG, so not just reporting on emissions and on your wider impact on the environment, but also thinking about your social and governance obligations. And I think one of the challenges is we're still developing, economists call it the nomenclature. The challenge is having a single set of standards that investors can turn to, and that's being developed, but I still think there's a lot further to go. And you can look to what's happened in the financial services and the work of the task force on financial related disclosures that the Bank of England and others have been involved in, where financial firms have to disclose their risks of their investment portfolio to climate risk. And that will soon be something that wider businesses outside of the financial services are likely to need to do. But we still need to have more efforts, and there's definitely work within the accounting community and more broadly about how we have clearly defined ways of determining what an individual company's carbon footprint is, as well as some of those the wider impact on our environment and biodiversity, as Dieter was referring to as well.
And Dieter, let me come to you then as well. What's your sort of view on how we should judge whether a company or the things we are buying, what really is the green impact of those, and what should we be looking for?
Okay, so there were two bits to your initial question. One was about the private sector investing, and the second one is about how to make these judgments. On the first one, I think there's one important point to make. So not only does the government believe, or the CCC says what the number will be if there are no government failures, we just had a discussion about a massive government failure, which is its failure to do carbon taxation. So what it tells you is we are looking at higher numbers. Now, the second thing that's true is that, and it's not just this Prime Minister, though, he's a specialist at it, we now live in the world of cakeism. So the one thing that's not allowed to happen is that prices are not allowed to go up. And that, it seems to me, is going to be part of the politics going forward. Just it has been for the last 10 years. Ed Miliband campaigned on electricity prices. You shouldn't underestimate how important this is. Now, the trouble is that if current customers aren't going to pay, and if current taxpayers are going to be paying for social care, NHS, and all the other things that Paul keeps so brilliantly pointing out in the press and elsewhere, and the IFS point out, there isn't going to be any extra taxpayers' money either. Okay, so what's the answer? Who's actually going to pay if you're a private investor? Where am I going to get my money back, and who's going to pay the return on? Answer is future customers and future taxpayers. So the next generation are going to get the costs of cleaning up the mess that we've dumped on them, apart from all the other things we've done to the next generation, which again, Paul has been very good at highlighting. And I just don't believe it. I just don't believe that actually future customers and future taxpayers are going to pay. And we've seen in the past defaults, reneging on policy, etc., in other European countries when the bills come home. Spain's most notorious. I think that investors really want to know how, if you can't force current customers and current taxpayers to pay, you're going to force future ones to do so going forward. So I think that's important. The second thing to say is on, and how do you know whether the companies and the deliverers of the investments in low carbon are actually delivering what they say? Now, recall I said sequestration is at least half the problem. Okay, and many of the carbon offset issues that are out there at the moment, this is at least as important as emissions. It's hardly ever mentioned in climate change discussions. So the sequestration side is much more complicated because you can plant eucalyptus trees all over Britain. They're the fastest growing trees and they'll sequestrate carbon the fastest. And they're quite easy to verify. You'll destroy the biodiversity, much like the conifer forests have done in Britain by focusing just on timber. So you have to have natural capital baselines, and you have to repeat those through time, and those are now becoming available. So there are real digital technologies to do that. And on the carbon emissions impacts, it's not obvious that there is a simple nirvana at the end, which gives you a unit measure, which just tells you the answer tick or cross, which the ESG community can then charge their fees for. You know, the emissions effects of any business are not just the exact emissions from their exact plant. It's the dropping the pebble in the water and looking at the ripples right through the frame. Do they lead to import substitutions? Do they cause things to be different in Kenya? What are the end effects of that? And I think we need to be sophisticated and realize that there is no unique single measure, but that we do have lots of technologies, and we must especially do this on the consumption side and on the land use side and the marine side and on the broader carbon offset market world. Otherwise, greenwashing will be even more widespread than sadly it already is.
And Paul, for you, let me pick up on something that Dieter just said in the start of his answer there. We obviously know that the government is in principle signed up to getting to net zero, and there seems to be quite widespread public support for the idea of cutting our emissions to net zero. But from your experience, to what extent do you think the government and the public are really bought into the realities of what that means in terms of the costs and the changes that are going to be coming, and what does that mean for the kind of policies that we do need to be adopting?
I don't think the public's got a clue, if I'm absolutely honest, in the sense that they've not noticed what's happened over the last decade. We've made big progress over the last decade, but the same electricity is coming out of your plug and nothing else has changed. Whereas over the next 30 years, things will change. If we're to meet net zero, we'll clearly all need to change to electric cars. Well, that ought to be okay, but you know, at some point we may be forcing people to get out of their old cars. We're going to be telling them to change their heating. We may well be seeing a significant change in industrial policy. We may see increases in prices if we have border carbon adjustments. We may need people to be changing their diets and their behaviours. I mean, there's a big change to get from here to net zero, as well as the 50 billion a year or whatever the number is of additional investment. And I think in a way, those who are saying we should get to net zero by 2025 or 2030 or some such equally utterly implausible suggestion are sort of playing on that ignorance to some extent, because I mean, you know, to get there in 2025 is literally not possible, and yet it still seems to be part of the debate, and that I think gives people the incorrect presumption that getting there by 2050 will be a doddle. Now, I think we can get there by 2050, but it ain't going to be a doddle. In terms of the government, I mean, you know, it depends what you mean by the government, as ever. But there clearly are people within government who understand what's required, and there clearly are a set of policies in train which will move us in the right direction. But as the Climate Change Committee says every time we report on this, there's nothing like the sets of policies actually set out and the sets of strategies actually set out clearly that will get us there, partly for some of the political reasons that we've discussed. Now, I'm still pretty optimistic despite all of that, that will make certainly on domestic emissions, really very good progress, and might even get to net zero or close to net zero over that time. But there are some, there are the big big issues around consumption emissions, which Dieter is absolutely right to raise. And I think partly, sort of coming back to your questions about ESG as well, I think the effectiveness of ESG and everything that Dieter and Rain said is absolutely right around sort of measurement, and I think in particular these issues around counterfactuals. But actually the big picture there, stepping back, is it will only work if people really want it to work. It's no good telling people that such and such company is not as green as such and such another company if they're not willing to change their behavior in response. And actually, these changes are slow and uncertain and don't necessarily have that much impact unless it goes with a really clear public view about which will actually hold people's feet to the fire on this. And we've seen this across all sorts of issues. It can change over time, but it really is that public, and part of that is the public reporting, but it's only one part of a multi-dimensional set of policies and changes in attitude and behavior you need to make that work. Just that change in reporting by itself will make, I imagine, quite a small amount of difference.
Thank you. I'll turn now to questions we've had coming in through the Q&A, and I'll pull together a few of these on similar themes. So we've had a question from Devon Varelia in London asking to what extent the COVID pandemic will have affected the ability of both government and people to pay for the transition to net zero. And there's other questions have come in about the sort of costs of doing things like converting your gas boiler to an air heat pump. And I wonder what you think about the fact of strained public finances coming out of the pandemic and for the ageing population reasons that Dieter already mentioned. But what that means for the mix of policies that we're likely to see between, I suppose, the sorts of things that Rain was alluding to, the sort of tax reliefs and subsidies to encourage the private sector and individuals and businesses to invest in these things, versus the sort of the more stick approach. Do we tax bad things? Do we regulate and force people to do these things because the public sector has less money to incentivise rather than force? Rain, perhaps I can come to you first.
Darn, I thought you were going to go for someone else first. Those are really hard questions. I'm going to do my best to sort of tackle them. And I think so I'm actually going to start from a sort of wider point about which is one of my slight bugbears where I think there is a problem in the system is I think if we focus solely on the not static cost, but just thinking about the overall impact on GDP and on emissions, one of the things we're really missing is the things that matter for people's individuals, which is quality of life and well-being, right? So I think and this was one of the challenges for the UK Committee on Climate Change when they were looking at some of the analysis around, making the recommendation to adopt the net zero target. They didn't look necessarily at some of the co-benefits in terms of health outcomes, but in terms of winning the public argument, it plays a huge role. And I think that's one of the challenges. If we look just too narrowly at the cost, we forget the sort of benefits on the other side. So if we're able to reduce air pollution, we know from work that we've done for the Clean Air Fund, if we can have better air quality, which is one of the co-benefits of obviously reducing emissions on our roads from combustion engines. So that's not the only part, right? Cars in their tires lead to air pollution. But if you can reduce air pollution, then obviously that improves our health outcomes. It can save, working days through people getting sick. It reduces the rates of asthma. So I think we do need to think about the co-benefits. And I think more broadly, the sooner we invest, the lower the costs overall. So I think that's something we absolutely have to bear in mind. Look, we know I'll leave it to Paul, the expert, around the challenges on our public finances, and obviously the pandemic, has placed a huge burden on our public finances. So I guess it comes back to the other issues. It isn't, yes, public investment is part of it, but we also need to unlock some of the private investment, and that is, it is a carrot approach. It's also a stick approach. I don't think you can have you can't just have one or the other. I think we need a sort of combination of all of those things for this to really work well.
Paul.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the first thing to say is that the pandemic has left us poorer, and if we're poorer, things are harder, and that's a sort of, that sort of really very basic statement seems to be lost in the general discussion about this. But I'm afraid it's true. Things don't get easier when you get poorer and get several £100 billion more in debt than you were last year. Things get harder. I think that's something that we should say virtually every day when people come up talking about whatever it is when it comes to building back better, as in terms of this being an opportunity. I mean, that said, yes, there is an opportunity here. There's an opportunity for two reasons. So there's an opportunity first for the sort of economic reason that for a period we will be underutilizing resources. So in an economic sense, government intervention might be less expensive than it was previously, because we're not going to be crowding out the private sector to the same extent. And secondly, for the political sense, that crises can offer you opportunities to do things differently. But that doesn't change the fact that, and it's going back to what Dieter was saying earlier, if you pay for a lot of stuff now, particularly when you're in a lot of debt now, then it is a future generation who will end up having to pay. So I think in the end, it hasn't changed. I don't think it changes the pandemic. I don't think it isn't really in the long run. It makes the economics more difficult. In the short run, it might make the economics a little bit easier. I don't think we should think of it as changing anything very much in terms of policy that's required or how we pay for it. And I think we're kidding ourselves if we think that it is. And I remember these conversations a decade or 11 or 12 years ago in the middle of the financial crisis, where there were very similar discussions, saying this is a crisis, there's lots of spare capacity, this is an opportunity for vast amounts of government money to go into green infrastructure and so on, and nothing of the sort happened. We went down a route which I think is, who knows the counterfactual, but I suspect very similar to the route we would have gone down without the crisis. But we've had, the economy is a lot smaller than it would have been without the crisis, and so we haven't had the resources actually to invest as we might otherwise have done so.
Thanks, Paul. We've also had a question from Chris Rumsey of the ABI, who asks, what role do you see for the insurance and long-term savings sector in the transition to net zero? We obviously have a lot of private savings sitting in things, including pensions. What's the role of that, and what changes to regulations might be needed or possible now that we've left the EU, including the Solvency II reforms, to unlock greater levels of investment in green assets? Dieter, can I come to you first on that one?
Okay, so the investment issue segues really neatly from what Paul has said. Just to reinforce, we are, in biodiversity sense and climate change sense, living beyond our environmental means. That's what Dasgupta says. That's what not paying as polluters for climate change says. So we have a standard of living which is inconsistent with the protection of the two key assets for the future of humanity, biodiversity and environment. And we're also, just an aside, living beyond our intergenerational obligations to our successors, for all the reasons that my generation's cheated on the young before we got anywhere near COVID, and we're poorer because of COVID. Okay, that's reality. Now, there are lots of Keynesians running around in the usual format saying, just spend, spend, spend. The multiplier effect will create an increase in income that'll generate investment. So investment flows from that, and then investment will carry, and it'll all work out perfectly. The idea that what we want to do is increase mankind's consumption even more than we're currently doing as a solution to living beyond our means, I struggle with. But I struggle with the framework of that as a whole. Now, the crux of all this is, well, we've got spare resources. Now, in Keynesian terms, it's just aggregate demand that's short. But of course, what really matters is whether it's consumption demand or investment demand, and whether we use the opportunity now to increase investment rather than increase consumption. After the Second World War, where we had 245% debt to GDP ratio, and we were in a very bad way, the state confiscated as much as it possibly could and diverted the resources into investment. And that's how we rebuilt the post Second World War frame. So now we say we're going to have a big investment program. Great, although that's not exactly what the white paper, etc., says. It's all about jobs now, about business now, about consumption now, as opposed to the investment component. So who's doing the investing? Because although it's true in the pandemic that people were forced to save, we do not have a high savings ratio in Britain. We rely on the comfort of strangers, foreigners, to invest in Britain. We run deficits domestically and externally, and we've just made our external deficit much worse through Brexit with the EU. And so we need capital inflows from abroad to invest because we don't save for investment. Right? And so if you look forward into this frame going forward, it's also, it's all this pension fund money. If we just corral it together, Osborne tried that too. Really? Who's buying up most of the infrastructure in Britain? It's foreign companies and foreign governments as part of the natural counterpart to the current account deficit on the balance of payments. Okay, and by the way, we're saying we don't really want any foreigners now to do this stuff. So I think there is a big gap as to who these people are who are going to provide the savings to make equal to the investment to fulfill what I think will be much more than 50 billion per annum, which is the number that the CCC came up with. Of course, we want to organise pension funds, etc. But let's just make sure that we tell them, the pensioners, whether we're doing this because it's just good investment practice, or whether we're doing it because we want them to subsidise for lower returns than they otherwise would have had. And that's, again, something the public is not being told. They're told that all this investment is really good stuff. And just as an aside, if you look back over the last year, I'm sure that tech stocks have done incredibly well, and there's definitely, in my view, a bubble in renewables. But the reason why the indexes look poor against the ESG funds is because the big parts of the indexes, things like oil and gas companies, faced a halving of the oil price in January before the pandemic. And so if you halve the value of key commodities, then you will get a differential performance, which people are now currently presenting as if it demonstrates that environmental investment is better than otherwise. And that leads to the very final point. If we believe all this stuff that we're told about renewables are cheaper than any other form of generation, that all these costs are falling across the board, let's just remember, we don't need to encourage anyone to invest, they will, and we don't need any subsidies either. We can abolish the subsidies. And I think that's rubbish. I think that the renewables need all the support they can get, and that's because the true system costs of renewables is not cost competitive yet. And those system costs, as people discovered with their recent electricity bills, are going up, not going down. So the investment story has behind it a bigger story about exactly what we're going to do in the state we're now in, which Paul described, which is we're poorer, a lot poorer than we thought we were, and that's before we've realised we're already living beyond our environmental and our generational means.
Thank you, Dieter. Brain, can I come to you, and perhaps, if possible, could you pick up on the point about changing regulations as well?
Yes, I'm just conscious of time, so let me just sort of counter through quite quickly some of those points. So first of all, like, what is the sort of role of the insurance industry and also sort of pensions, which is related but different. I think first of all, if you think about what individuals can do, there is a big campaign, Make My Money Matter, where people can be more mindful about where they are investing their pensions. I think the industry responds to incentives, so I think the more people can think, where are they investing their pension, that is a huge role that can be that can be played. Now, the whole role around finance is absolutely needs to be focused on outcomes in the real economy. So really thinking about how that is focused on decarbonising heat in our homes, developing new technologies around carbon capture, usage and storage, or thinking about how we decarbonise transport. So and I think also on the insurance industry, in some sense, they are facing some of the risks from climate change first, whether that's here in the UK and the risks from flooding and from more extreme climate events, or whether that's thinking more globally about people who are more exposed to some of those risks. So I think, you know, in a way that the insurance industry is absolutely at the forefront of the impact from climate change. And finally, just to sort of add, I really support what I think Dieter has said around natural capital accounting. I think we need that absolutely for us as a government, and I think we also need to think about what the equivalent for that is for individual companies. And finally, yes, what we need to see in this recovery from the pandemic, but more broadly, is anything we can do, not just to increase public investment in low carbon technologies, but absolutely it's about business investment more generally. It's always been the sort of holy grail in recoveries in the UK economy. We do need to think about ways in which we stimulate business investment. It's much easier to say than to do. It's about thinking about our tax system. It's about helping smaller companies adopt digital technologies, but absolutely, ideally, we want to have that focus on business investment to make this a more sustainable recovery.
Thank you, Rain. And Paul, let me come to you with one very quick final question, because as Rain noted, we are almost up on our time. We haven't spoken a lot about distributional implications. You touched on it in your opening remarks, and you also touched on the point that there are upfront costs to this decarbonisation, but some long-term benefits, for example, the lower costs of heating better insulated houses and that sort of thing. What are your sort of thoughts on the extent to which those longer term benefits are likely to accrue to the same or different types of people who would be the ones facing the upfront costs of this?
Well, in partly it depends who does face the upfront costs. Of course, if we do this through borrowing, whether public or private, as Dieter was saying earlier, then the plan at least would be for future generations to face a lot of those costs. Although, you know, I think it's pretty clear that, as I say, with a lot of the decarbonisation, at least a significant chunk of the decarbonisation of electricity, it is current consumers who have faced those upfront costs. Second point is, if you were just to do this entirely through the market with tax, appropriate tax instruments, you'd probably find that was pretty regressive, because you would be having quite high taxes on consumption of fuel and food and things like that, which we know are a higher fraction of the budgets of people on lower incomes. So you would need to have some significant redistribution alongside that, which is perfectly possible. There's plenty of ways of changing other bits of the tax and welfare and public services system to compensate people for that. I think the point about generational costs is quite a tricky one, in a sense that, you know, arguably it is future generations who will benefit from this relative to a world in which we do nothing. So it's not entirely unreasonable to expect them to pay for some of this, and it doesn't seem to be reasonable to expect a single generation who happen to be around at the moment to pay for it all either. So spreading it over time, you know, you can make a case for that. I think the question is whether that is either sort of feasible in the sense of a credible policy, in the sense that we can be sure that people will pay that back, or indeed feasible in the sense of a policy, given the scale of other borrowing and debts that we've got, that can be achieved under current circumstances. And as I say, I think that's one of the reasons why the current state of the economy is a reason not for celebration in terms of what you can do with respect to climate change, but for additional worry.
Thank you very much. And thank you all so much for your contributions to today's events. And thank you to our sponsors for today's event. And thank you to all of you for tuning in to watch this. Please do join us for the next of today's events, which will start at 4:30 on looking at how can countries work together to make a success of COP26.